Probably, I would say, earlier in the year before we were kind of more decisive knowing about what was going to happen with the coup. But anywho, oops, we've run into it. Yeah, so I guess we should go around, just get started with getting a sense of what people are interested in learning today. I want to keep me talking as much as, as minimal as possible and really open up conversation, but really ground us in a conversation based on what's been going on and kind of some recent history. I have a good sense of kind of the history of Venezuela overall, as well as the position of Venezuela within Latin America and generally the United States interventions in Latin America. But we can start over here. Just anything you're interested in learning about today, so I can try to cover it.
Well, I've been following the coups happening in Latin America and just all the, toppling of governments, but I'm probably not as updated as it could be, and I'd like to be more updated.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, same here, just to learn more about what's happening in Venezuela and as you say, its relationship to South America.
Sure.
Yeah, I was curious as to what went on when you were protecting the embassy, how that played out. I know a number of Greens were there. I think Kevin Zeese was there and some others.
Margaret Flowers, I don't know if she's a Green, but she's
right,
there.
yes, she is. And
Ursula Rosen.
Yeah, she is. Yeah, just curious as to how that went on and what you thought about it.
Okay, cool. I'll definitely touch on that. Anything you're interested in learning about Charles?
Everything. I'm a sponge right now.
Cool.
I have to admit to pretty much ignorance of the whole South American situation as it currently stands. I used to know a lot, and then several decades went by when I didn't pay attention.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know how much of it's just sort of the same old stuff that's been going on for decades, like when we messed with Chile, and in what ways is it different or an intensification? And I don't know any of the details, I haven't soaked up details.
Awesome.
There's been a lot of stuff happening in Latin America recently, and as a result of what's going on like Chile and then Bolivia, there's kind of been a lot more media silence surrounding Venezuela, so I'm curious as to how some of that information, since it was last big news, has been updated over time, and where we are exactly now.
Great, thanks, Tim.
I guess there's a lot of current stuff, but I remember Robert Kennedy was doing something with fuel oil in Venezuela. I don't know if that's still going on, but that goes back decades, I would think. So
Half a century.
There's a lot of current stuff, but I'm just curious also about the history of it.
Past history. Word. So I'm going to get mostly into the coup and really talk about recently what's happened this past year. So this past year in 2019, Venezuela has had a long history of U.S. attempted intervention. It also has its own unique history too in terms of coming to socialism. We're going to talk a lot about socialism in Venezuela. There's a lot of misconceptions here in the United States about what it exactly is, what it means, what it looks like. There's a lot of people think, Venezuela, when it came to Chavez, people might have had different feelings or opinions. He was the former president of Venezuela, very, very widely beloved by the people, and he passed away. And after he died, who took his place was Nicolas Maduro, who was elected by the people of Venezuela. But a lot of people have, not certainty about what exactly that means or what that looks like. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and kind of the Venezuelan people's support of their government, what that looks like. About 70% currently today. 75 next year, 70% of Venezuela's spending goes towards social programs. It's almost, in a way, unimaginable in the United States to think of a government that spends 70% of its budget on social programs, meaning housing, food, healthcare, all of the things to make life functional. But however, the big context of Venezuela, which I'm going to talk about as well, and the coup, is that the U.S. has had sanctions on the country. And if you guys remember sanctions during the Iraq War, I know it's interesting too, during the Iraq War there was a big kind of rallying cry, sanctions, not war, when in reality sanctions are an act of war when we really look on the ground at the real impacts of people. So we will talk a bit about the impacts of the sanctions on Venezuelans, on the economy, what that looks like, what that means. And a big part of what we do as an organization, as Answer and the Embassy Protection, and what we've done with that is really bringing attention to the fact that these sanctions are not only destroying the economy of Venezuela, but they are crippling, they're crippling people in so many ways individually, but the people of Venezuela resist and have found incredible ways to not only fight back, but continue to maintain programs like the CLAPS programs, which are a program where essentially they have boxes of food that are prepared locally in the community that they give out to everybody in the community. So despite sanctions, there are still incredible programs that are happening, which is why the Venezuelan government, which announced 75%, is now they're moving 5% more of their budget towards social programs, it's a point of pride for them because despite some very restrictive situation, they're still able to provide for people in a way most countries don't, especially in Latin America. So this is a bit of my overview of what happened in the coup. Why is the U.S. so interested in Venezuela? One, it's a socialist country. That's probably the number one reason why the United States is interested in Venezuela, aside from the oil, which is the other top number one reason why the U.S. is interested in Venezuela. The history of Venezuela, much like the rest of Latin America, not just South America, but Central America as well, as countries essentially were founded as nations that had singular exports. It's called the Banana Republics, which is weird when you think about the name brand Banana Republic. That's actually where it came from. The idea that individual countries were, you were a banana republic, your country just did bananas, or your country just did one specific particular export. Like Cuba was sugarcane. The only thing that Cuba did made was sugarcane. So you have a long history of having a country that essentially had one export. And that is incredibly hard to think about fixing because not only is your infrastructure physically built around that export, so oil is the case in Venezuela. That's the number one export, and the historical export of Venezuela has always been oil. So the entire economy, the entire country, everything that was physically built in Venezuela was built by colonizers who had one intention, which was to extract oil. And so that is really important as a context because, when you think about it, if you look at these, there's a map, I wish I had it, but there's really cool maps that you can see in Africa and in Latin America that trains, roads, every single building is built around singular exports. So there's no trains going to where people live. There are no roads going to where people live. They're going to where oil is. And so that is the country that was inherited by the Chavez government when he was elected into power. And I can get into all that later, but in particular, what's important about that is that history of underdevelopment means that even though Venezuela is a socialist country, it's still struggling against a lot of innate poverty and a lot of economic struggles to try to overcome that. This year, the United States, in an attempt to undermine Venezuela, which not only is a socialist country and as a country with oil is of incredible importance, it's also geopolitically very important. If you look at a map, Venezuela is on the map. It's near Bolivia, it's near Colombia. If you think about South America, it's a very important place, not just for its oil, but for its geopolitical significance. And so the U.S. absolutely wants to overturn that because Venezuela influences other countries in the region in South America. So what had happened this year is that there was a coup attempt that was backed by the Trump government. In essence, there was a man named Juan Guaido, which literally not even the right-wing parties in Venezuela knew about. Nobody knew who this man was actually at all, which is really important. They didn't even try, the U.S. didn't even try to bolster, internal right-wing groups. So they just kind of picked a guy and was like, this is our guy. And so that unfolded in a sense making that people were very confused by why is all of a sudden Juan Guaido being called the president. This doesn't make any sense. Really, it didn't. He just declared himself the president. And then moving into that, the U.S. continues to attempt to force humanitarian aid. We saw this unfolding where the U.S. was talking about, Maduro is a dictator, everything's terrible in Venezuela, it's so bad, it's so bad. Juan Guaido has to be the president, he's going to come in and fix things, and then we're going to put humanitarian aid, we're going to get it through the border. And that became a really big struggle where they used Colombia as a way to shove aid into Venezuela, but it wasn't really aid. It was a very confusing situation. I have a whole video on it if we want to see about that. But in particular, the biggest thing I just wanted to note about the context of Venezuela are these things with the blackouts. During this time where we have Juan Guaido saying he's the president, we have also a lot of right-wing violence in the streets. And so the government is trying to do what it can to control this violence. When we say right-wing violence, we generally mean lynchings, which is a big important part of this, is that the right wing in Venezuela is not just, okay, we want capitalism. They also want a lot of other things that are based in very racist ideas. And if you go to Venezuela and you talk to people, you start to get this sense that just like in Venezuela, just like here in the US, there are racial divisions, there are the same types of issues that you see crop up. And the right wing over there is incredibly racist. And one of the big things that they hate about Maduro is one, he's not like a white Latino, like that's something that they don't like about him. Also, he was a bus driver. So they tend to put him down. If you see in some of the memes that they're making, well, at the time they were making about Maduro that are negative images, they would say, oh, he's just a bus driver, just, putting him down. But can you imagine if we had a president who was a bus driver, who could understand what that means, really to work in this country, work, period. There's no people who are workers in government here. So anywho, so this is kind of what happened. The U.S. was attempting to also sabotage, create blackouts, which created widespread panic in Venezuela that the United States would be bombing the country. I mean, if you all of a sudden are having blackouts, some of our organizers were trapped there. They couldn't leave. They were in the airport. They were supposed to go home, trapped, because there's nothing that you can do. It's very terrifying to have blackouts. And that's important when we talk a little bit about fear and this kind of misnomer of dictatorship. So what ended up happening with the blackouts was that after the blackouts, we also see that there is a massive revolutionary energy. I'm going to skip ahead of this video just to show you guys some really amazing stuff about this. This is, we can come back to that right here. So during this time, during the coup attempt, there was also massive resistance in the streets of people saying that, we don't want this Juan Guaido situation. There are blackouts in our country. Consistently over and over again, we are seeing that there's a sabotage happening. So this was what was going on in the streets in Venezuela. We'll watch a little bit of this clip. I don't know if there's any sound or anything like that. Of people protesting and fighting back against the coup. This is all stuff that the CLAPS program is providing because the sanctions make taxes so expensive on imports that things like tampons are incredibly hard to pay for and get. So these are also medical supplies. So I'm going to skip to the end where there's just a bunch of, these are some of the protests that were happening in February. So essentially, what you just saw was people started to build a people's military, a people's militia as a way to defend their government and to say the U.S. cannot invade Venezuela whatsoever or have this type of influence. So where we stand today with the coup is that essentially because of that kind of resistance, which you still see in the streets in Venezuela today, just last Sunday there were massive protests because the fear isn't over. But Juan Guaido, it was a failed attempt. Ultimately, nobody knew who he was, and he never was ever able to consolidate power in any way. And so the Bolivarian revolution continues, and the people, because of their mobilizing, because of those militias, and because of the massive outpouring of support, were able to hang on to the sovereignty of their nation. So unlike in Bolivia, which we'll talk about in a minute, that the U.S. was not able to get a foothold, was not able to convince the military to turn against its government, was not able to convince massive sectors of the population to support the U.S. They were unable to actually penetrate into Venezuela. That doesn't mean it's not possible for the future, but right now that is the situation. So as Venezuela continues to be attacked, it's still sanctioned. What you saw in the collapse program is very important. Medical supplies are heavily taxed, and so, not taxed, it's the correct word, heavily, these import costs are very intense because essentially Venezuela is unable to produce a lot of these goods themselves. And that is because of that history of underdevelopment. And so what are you supposed to do with that? So anywho, I'm gonna go into some of this stuff in a sec. I wanna just show a little video about Bolivia and talk about Bolivia. So the other reason why I wanna flip over to Bolivia is understanding that Venezuela it's also part of an entire attack on all of Latin America and South America in particular. The US does not like the historical pink tide, as it's been called, the moving towards socialism, the moving towards leftist ideas, the moving towards ideas of actually giving people what they need. That has been a big part of movements in Latin America. And so we saw with Brazil in this past year that Brazil now has a fascist government, straight fascist government. Bolsonaro is also like good friends with Trump, so go figure how that happens. With Ecuador, we see people rising up against all different things that are going on. Colombia is really a backwards, very, very right-wing government. People are fighting back against it. But regardless, historically, there has been a tide of left-leaning history in Chile, which is incredible. And you see the people are fighting back in Chile, but historically, they also had a socialist government at one point too. So the U.S.'s whole kind of move in Latin America has been not only to have access to endless resources, but to put down socialist revolutions wherever they rise. So Bolivia is a case of this, where unfortunately people were not able to act quite in the same decisive way that they were in Venezuela. So just a quick history on Bolivia. In 2009, the Bolivian constitution was updated to actually make the country a secular and pluralistic state. In particular, Evo Morales, which we might have heard a lot about recently, he is one of the few, if not only, indigenous presidents in the world. He is indigenous Andean person. I think he's Cajun. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm like 90% sure. It would make no sense if he wasn't Cajun. But anyway, so Cajun people are the indigenous people of Bolivia. And in particular, not only has he made the country, like if you see, there's a rainbow flag. If you've seen that rainbow flag a lot, there was actually a video of the military where there was a rainbow flag on one side and then the Bolivian traditional flag on the other. And the military, after the coup, has been cutting out the traditional, the Wifala, the indigenous flag, and burning it. There's a lot of anti-indigenous sentiment in Bolivia. The military, the police included with this kind of idea. So a lot of the anti-Evo Morales stuff you see has a lot of racist undertones to it. It's not just, oh yeah, he was a dictator, let's look deeper into what that's been said. He also was one of the only presidents to really formally recognize the Quechua language and bring it to prominence, as well as really honoring treaties and sovereignty of indigenous people. So really, when you think about, if you care a lot about indigenous rights in particular, Bolivia is an incredible place for that, and really understanding what MAS, which was his party, was able to do. And they also reduced extreme poverty from 38% to 18% in their time in government. And additionally to that, literacy increased from 70% to 97%. These are just some small snippets of what the Morales government was able to do. Also increasing significant representation of women and indigenous people in government. That's a huge part of what they were able to achieve. I wanted to just show about the coup because unfortunately they were not able to come together in quite the same way. So a lot of the right-wing violence you'll see in Bolivia is still playing out. It's only a minute. Oh, 60%. So that was just a quick little overview of what's been going on in Bolivia. Like it kind of suggested, the right-wing violence has been out of control. People are being killed left and right. There are, especially indigenous people, are being murdered in the streets. There's been a mainstream media blackout here in the U.S. about what exactly is going on. All of this is funded, of course, by the United States, and all of this is supported by the United States. And so when we think about what's going on in Bolivia, we think about what's going on in Venezuela, they are deeply, intimately connected and tied with the same agenda of destabilization, because Bolivia as a country is pulling itself out of poverty and doing that by using socialism as its basis of its economic system as well as the social system. So, anywho, I figured I would highlight how Bolivia and currently what's going on in Bolivia is so uniquely connected to Venezuela because of its own progressive history. And the only thing to really take away to know about this is that the U.S. is not going to stop at attacking Venezuela. The people of Bolivia were not able to come together quite the same way. The military of Bolivia unfortunately turned against Evo in the presidency and instead chose to side with the United States and with these fascists who came into power. It's complicated with a woman who's supposedly the president. It's a very odd situation there. But all that to say is that when we talk about people saying that Maduro is a dictator or any of the things like that, when you really go into that history, it becomes very apparent that if people wanted to in Venezuela support the U.S. coup, they would have. I mean, that's what happened in Bolivia. It's completely doable and possible, but they didn't want to because, in fact, the most terrifying thing is not that they're afraid of a dictator, they're afraid of the United States, which literally caused blackouts in their country. So I guess, I've jumped around a lot of different places. I wanted to try to do everything I can to set us up to talk deeper about different things and different elements of this, but the best thing to take away from understanding Venezuela is that because it's a socialist country that has oil, the United States will stop at nothing to overthrow it. And the fact that it failed, it's an international embarrassment for the U.S. And on top of being an international embarrassment for the U.S., also gives hope to people all around the world and in Latin America that they can resist against U.S. intervention. And so that is also very dangerous for the U.S., and they are going to do everything they can to stop that. And Bolivia continues to unfold in Latin America. All across Latin America, we see people's movements uprising, like in Chile and Ecuador and other countries, Colombia right now with a national strike. So Latin America continues to be a hotbed of activity for leftist organizing and for people fighting back and trying to take control of their governments away from, of course, the U.S. and other governments that are bought into the U.S.'s pockets. So I guess I'll stop here. I don't want to just keep chatting on about things. I guess I want to go with just questions and thoughts and kind of go in a more direct way of wherever people are interested in going. Try to give a brief overview as best as I could. Cool. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So it's hard to just ask my question out bluntly, because
Yeah.
right now I feel like just being an American and everybody's looking at how much opportunity we have here, and Americans in general take it for granted, and we have a very divided nation. And because of the limited amount of attention the media puts onto Latin America, I don't get a good sense of who has the popular support in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
So is there like is it as divisive down there, do you know, as we are here?
That's a good question. I would say the vast majority of people in Venezuela support Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution. So it's a very different kind of experience there than it is here. Also, democracy is real in Venezuela in a way that it's actually not real here. Like y'all know, especially as the Green Party, that democracy is not real in the U.S. But yeah, like you actually, in Venezuela, for example, like the way that elections work, it's both different and the same, but there's essentially it's a people's assembly. And so it's with a people's assembly, you elect people on a very local level, and those people on a local level can go on to essentially all come together and be able to decide the constitution of the government. And so they have things like that as well. I know the woman in that video, the collapse video, she was somebody who was also on a local level, a local elected official. There's a lot of things like that you don't see. Like Maduro will just go out, he'll stand in a car and he'll address the Portuguesa. Yes, every single different state of Venezuela is in there. So
I just remember when
yeah,
Maduro was first elected, there was such negative press here that people thought, were ready to vote to send military into Venezuela.
mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. There's been a lot of negative press about him. And that's why I always encourage you, if you really go and read some of the stuff that's being written, like I was mentioning with making fun of him for being a bus driver, if you really go into that stuff and you start really breaking down what are people upset about, a lot of what people are upset about, like people here in the U.S. or wealthier Venezuelans, what they've been upset about for, it's not a socialist revolution in the sense of they overthrew the government in just a very intense, they were an elected government that came into a capitalist system, and now they're trying to implement socialism by being elected and already being elected in a position of holding state power, but not exactly consolidated, if that makes sense. There's capitalism and capitalists that they had to kind of figure out and negotiate. Maduro started to go in the direction of really wanting more open socialist policies of nationalizing businesses, and that's when a lot of people got very upset because Chavez hadn't done that, and so that was he had, but it depended on the specific industries and whatnot, but he was moving in that direction. But Maduro really did that, and that was really kind of what caused a lot of that tension that you saw. So people started selling shit in Colombia, which was terrible. They started taking a lot of the business people and the capitalists, big factory owners, just started hoarding a lot of their stuff in Colombia, for example, and trying to artificially change prices of goods as a way to tank the economy, so that way, Maduro will look bad to the world,
So do you think that was part of the picture? I didn't hear much criticism about him being a bus driver, but I heard he's a dictator because of all the private jets and the food engorging that he had. And I'm like, well, that's kind of complicated because I don't specifically watch him eat all the time. Maybe he had to scarf some stuff down because he was busy earlier in the day. It just kind of, like, why paint a picture about someone as a dictator because he's eating a lot of food? But then I see the Guaido rallies and I'm like, well, so genuinely I see there's two sides and so I get concerned. But and then of course knowing that there's the U.S. that is trying to back, you know, Guaido and repress all of Maduro's economic control is just unacceptable. And are there any updates like that we don't know about? Because it looks like Guaido is kind of diminishing his confrontation with that. And is there any possible chance that Maduro will have? I mean, like there was so much stuff coming out. Like he was getting gold, and he was buying. That he made 2 deals with China and maybe Iran for oil that he was able to make. Like Maduro, because the U.S. wouldn't allow anybody to do any trading with Maduro while this was happening. So the only ones who would do business was China and Iran. I'm not sure.
Well, let's open up. Let's have more of a conversation then. Some people's thoughts of things that they've read or things they're wondering about. Go for it, Danny.
Yeah, in regards specifically to like, you know, Maduro and his government trading with like China and Iran, I think it's important to bring up when discussing like these different, you know, global South countries going out and trading with powers like China. In large part, what China does is it's offering a avenue for these countries to expand their economic development without having to go to groups like the IMF, without having to go to these type of neoliberal institutions. And so I think when we're looking at those things and we're looking at how a lot of media in, you know, like this country tries to spin it where it's like, oh, look at the types of people they're willing to make deals with must mean they're a dictator.
That's all they're limited to me.
Exactly. Those are the people that if they don't want to go and then start implementing these types of neoliberal policies, if they don't want to be opening themselves up to more foreign intervention on the parts of like the United States and other you know, global north countries, they have to go to countries like China. They have to go to countries like Iran because those are the countries that are willing to do deals with them without then going in and saying, here are the economic policies that you have to implement if you're going to be trading with us.
Thanks.
I think this recent U.S. interventions actually began in Paraguay a number of years ago. Lugo was the first one to go through an administrative coup, and I think, you know, when you're comparing Venezuela and Bolivia, you know, I think a lot of the comparisons you made are good. In other words, that in Venezuela they were able to consolidate over a period of years, especially under Chavez, so that people are willing to really fight very hard for, you know, to keep their sovereignty. I don't think the same thing happened in Bolivia, because I remember one of the issues that was faced. I think Evo Morales at some point thought or realized that he had to develop a lot of you know, activity and money in extraction of natural gas. And it was done, as I understand it, in a lot of the areas that were in fact indigenous, and a lot of the indigenous people did not appreciate that he was really going against what he had promised initially. And that so when this started happening with this coup, which is correct, I mean, it is a, you know, US-backed coup, the military is killing people, but the country was not united in part because of, I don't know if it was a mistake that Evo Morales did in trying to foist gas extraction on people that really didn't want it. In other words, it wasn't a united country the way, I mean, not as totally united, but as much so as Venezuela. And I think that's part of the problem he's had. Same thing like with Cuba. Cuba's been, you know, independent since '59. So those people are very willing to fight for their country. In other words, revolutions take it, you know, it's really, you know, deeply felt there. Also in Venezuela, but not in Bolivia, and Paraguay never really got off the, you know, got to, let's say the strength that Venezuela did, it just never, it just was starting to move in that direction. So it's, but these countries are, I mean, when you have sanctions like this, I mean, eventually, even people that really believe that they want to keep their sovereignty, that wears them down year after year after year, it's not going to end well unless something dramatic happens. In my opinion, how long can people subject themselves to that? I mean, you see, like back in the 70s, Mexico. I lived in Mexico in the 70s. It was a very independent, or somewhat compared to now, independent country. With all this pressure on Mexico year and year, their action becomes limited, basically because of U.S. imperialism. They take advantage of any kind of breaks in the country, to kind of class differential, and it's rough to respond.
Yeah,
That's
the
mine.
media, the media also plays off of that when they
Oh,
say
yeah.
these
Media,
countries,
yes.
countries are failing, so the refugees are only coming to our country because of how poorly their governments work, but it's our government that impacted them and forced the economic strife. So
Like in Honduras, Guatemala, you look
Honduras is a
back
good
to
one.
the 50s.
I mean, 2009, I mean, the coup in Honduras, like, Honduras is like the majority of people that were coming in those caravans.
Right.
If you guys remember, like, the migrant caravans, the majority of people were coming from Honduras specifically.
Right.
And that was, after the 2009 coup on President Zelaya, which was, like, ridiculous what happened. I mean, the U.S. basically picked him up, put him in, like, a plane, like, and his pajamas, everything, and it was wild. They just picked him up in the middle of the night and then dropped him. Like, I forget where they put him. I think it was Mexico. They just dropped him in a whole other place. And I mean, the whole point was to make a strong showing that we will kill you and your whole family if you continue down this path. So anyway, Honduras has been in chaos ever since. I mean, it's not a coincidence for any reason that there's so many refugees coming from places like Colombia and places like Honduras, that these are like places where the United States not only has active coups but also continues to have a stronghold of like essentially being able to control the government in those places. But anywho, it's a lot of things to think about. I think, to me, I always think about what is my role, as an activist here in the U.S. and wading through the propaganda in particular. And I think the most important thing for us here is to recognize how badly we need to fight against these sanctions. Because, we can talk all day about what mistakes could be made in places, but I mean, like, really, what would you do? What would you do if you're running a country? Like, a lot of people fault Venezuela. Like, there's a mismanagement of the economic system. There's mismanagement of the economics. I mean, you're inheriting a country for hundreds of years that was underdeveloped. And on top of that, you now have sanctions, meaning that in order for you to be able to fix some of your economic problems, you're going to need to be able to start being self-sustainable, meaning that you have to be able to create it for yourself. Who is going to help you do that? Where? I mean, really, what company is going to help you, a country, a socialist country, learn how to produce diapers, for example, like diaper factories, which is a big thing that they need there. There's no company that's going to do that. And so then you have to import those things. There's really no other choice. And then, or you can trade with other countries that will trade with you, but now there's a right-wing government happening in all the rest of Latin America. Who are you going to trade with? So what is going to happen, right? There's the strangling, really, of the country. So I think it's important to really think about how complicated it is to fix these issues. Like, the United States is very privileged in that the entire world dollar is essentially tied to the US dollar. Venezuela doesn't have that kind of luxury. So if you have a full economic implosion in your country like we did in 2009, in 2009, the U.S. could just pump all of its money back into the banks and do what it can, just quote unquote recover, even though we didn't recover, the capitalists recovered. And like, they're able to do that, but what can Venezuela do? People fault Venezuela, like, oh, you tried to put money into your economy and then you created inflation, and but what country doesn't try to do that? You have to find a way to stabilize, you have to find a way to reach that point. So it's just, to me, like, yeah, you could talk all day about mistakes that are made in other places, but I feel like, to me, my role here in the United States is to really recognize the complexity of every situation and the deep nuance that exists personally. Just because, right, these sanctions create a situation where none of us, you cannot do anything as a country and thrive. Cuba somehow managed to function. I mean, but it's incredible how much more could be really done if there weren't sanctions on the country. So that's kind of our perspective. I guess other people's thoughts just on this discussion. Yeah, get in.
I'm not surprised that the Trump administration has got its fingers in this and is supporting the overthrow by right wing. But there are plenty of politicians at the moment trying to make a career out of making a point of how inept Donald Trump and his administration is. And as far as hearing this, among the things mentioned that he hasn't handled well, might as well be crickets chirping. Am I missing something, or is there a complete lack of any criticism of all of this endeavor on the part of the Democratic Party candidates?
Yeah, I definitely don't think you're wrong there. I mean, interesting fact too about Democratic Party candidates and their positions on Venezuela, it was rough. Like, that's the best way to describe it. It was rough. Yeah. I mean, really, like, it was like, what? Oh my God. Like, Warren tweeted the worst stuff about Bolivia recently. It was terrible. About, like, yeah, we need free and fair elections in Bolivia. Like, are you kidding me? This was a free and fair election. The only thing they were really even fighting over was whether or not it was 8% of a lead or 10% of a lead in terms of the actual election. I mean, what world do we live in? In the United States, when has there been an 8 to 10% lead?
Right.
And that we're fighting about 2%. I mean, presidents win with a 2% or 1% more, like, right, you know what I mean? Like, vote count. So it's outrageous to me. But yeah, what do you say, Dan?
Yeah, and I mean, just speaking of the vote count, Donald Trump, president of the United States, got out of 60% of the voting population that voted, got less than 30% of that vote, and is still the president. But yeah. I don't see, politicians in different countries like Canada, Germany, UK calling for a military coup in the United States. But in regards to, like, the Democrats and their kind of silence in regards to things like Venezuela, or in some cases open support of it, that is something that you see kind of time and time again when the U.S. gets involved in all of these different countries, is that the two major political parties don't actually tend to really fight that much over it. Even in the case of Bolivia recently, there were a few U.S. politicians who did actually speak out against it and refer to it as a military coup, but even amongst those, three that condemned it, you have, like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. Even then, at the same time that they're condemning it, they're not saying, oh yeah, so, Evo Morales is a legitimate president, he should be in charge. They're saying, oh no, we need free and fair elections in Bolivia.
Right.
The only one, to my knowledge, that was openly saying, no, this is a coup and we need to support Evo Morales was Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the case of Bolivia, where it was kind of clear cut, there was a, the military had the president step down, and it was a military coup. Even then, the people condemning it were at the same time not actually willing to say, oh, they shouldn't have overthrown this guy. They were just saying they should have overthrown him in a different way.
Well, didn't Bernie Sanders, did he come out against Maduro?
He did come out against Maduro, yeah,
Very
heavily.
When you say not Evo Morales, that's a little different.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Evo
because
Morales.
I feel like Bolivia is a little bit more paletable.
Yeah.
It's actually not palatable. It's just way harder to deny. Like, if
Yeah.
you look at the actual statistics and facts, I mean, for a while, even some of the capitalists, were very neutral in some ways on what's been going on in Bolivia, because it's just, you can't deny the incredible development that's happened under Mas and under Evo Morales. So I think that kind of might have been why he did that, that it seemed like to him, like, okay, it's more obvious and apparent, and it's a lot more dangerous and scary, supposedly, to support a government like Venezuela. So that's my take. I mean, I don't necessarily know why he does what he does.
Called Maduro like a vicious tyrant, right?
Yeah, something like that is outrageous. I mean, literally recently in the last couple weeks, the Patriot Act, repassed. Like, come on, we're all talking about impeachment for whatever reason. I guess just because CNN keeps talking about impeachment, never shuts up about it. But the truth is that, like, we not only have $700,000 of food stamps being cut right now, potentially 2.2 million people. Well, I mean, not 700,000 people being impacted by food stamp
May I
cuts.
have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes.
Okay.
Wish to buy materials, please come to the checkout desk now. All the computers will be turned off. Thank you.
Waiting, cool. Or like 2.2 million people might be losing their access to food. I mean, this is serious. And like all the while, the Democrats and the Republicans have shook hands, and so we're going to pass an insane increase to the war budget. I mean, it's just, come on, like let's keep that really honest about what's going on here. And the international issues of Venezuela and Bolivia, and to me, I use them as these mark points, these ear points, these touch points to see like where a candidate really stands. Because at the end of the day, you can feel what you want to feel about what's going on, about the specifics of Bolivia, the specifics of Venezuela, but these are countries that are being starved, that are providing for their people in ways that we can't even imagine here. And they're being starved and punished for it because of supposed human rights abuses that I don't think anyone is able to really even point to. I don't even know exactly what's going on that's a human rights abuse in Venezuela particularly, other than capitalists being angry that they can't make money anymore. So that's kind of my thoughts on it, but yeah.
I seem to recall when I was considerably younger that there was a lot more domestic criticism of the CIA intervention against Salvador Allende and support for Pinochet. So what's different between then and now?
Difference between then and now in terms of the movement here in the U.S.?
Yeah, why is were there more people inclined to be critical then and now it's
50 years. 50 years of change for the worse.
I love this.
Well, my theory, my take on it would be, a couple of things. One, I mean, anti-communism is the unofficial religion of the United States. I always say that because, and then the 60s, the 50s, what was going on? We're talking about the CPUSA at its height or something was 500,000 members or some insane number I actually can't even fathom today. God knows what it is today. Literally they're, whatever. Anyways, but 500,000 people were in the Communist Party of the United States, and they aggressively destroyed that. The whole new left that came out in the 60s was at least politically grounded in the idea that we need to be against intervention, we need to be against war, and the Democratic Party also had to toe that line in some ways too sometimes, because in order for it to be able to get the support it needed to pretend to care about peace.
Right.
We're so beyond that at this point. They don't even care about peace as a concept, let alone anti-war, which are two totally different things. So my kind of theory about it has been, the U.S. aggressive destruction of the left, from the Black Panther Party and to literally even the RCP. The RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, had, the FBI intervened deeply in that organization and created a lot of what it is today. There's a whole book on it. It's called Heavy Radicals. It's a really fascinating book of the U.S., the U.S.'s attempt to destroy the new left and the coming out of the 60s. And so that, to me, is kind of what drove the authentic voice of anti-war really into the ground. And it reemerged in 2001 with the Iraq War protests, massive amounts of protests against the war. And really, that's something we don't even talk about, ever. I've never seen a documentary that talks about the Iraq anti-war protests, even though they were some of the largest in U.S. history. And so it's a fascinating kind of dynamic. So I just think that they got really smart about that in destroying the left and really doing everything they can to silence an anti-war voice. But we see it reemerging. I've seen a lot of that recently, and in ways that shock me. I've been organizing forever, but when I first started organizing, Palestine was even considered a very controversial topic. Yeah. In 2001, we were getting in fights with organizations that didn't support Palestine because we couldn't. Essentially, that was something that we weren't going to compromise on, and that was an issue for a lot of people. They came for us as an organization. Oh, Answer Coalition, you support Al Qaeda, crazy shit. Just because we were pro-Palestine, because all the connection to Hezbollah, the connection to all these different connections they were drawing. So that has changed a lot. We're in a moment that I was surprised by. We got one of the largest. That demo that it was talked about in February. It's one of the largest demos for Venezuela in recent memory. I really can't, it was something like 1,000, 2,000 people. I don't remember the exact numbers, but that's how many people came out, and that shocked me. Because for Syria, it was 300 people for when we were doing stuff against U.S. intervention in Libya, it was 200 people. I remember that. So that's a marked improvement of people willing to say no to U.S. intervention. So that's a really interesting dynamic I've seen. What is other people's thoughts on why? Yes.
Well, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I think Venezuelan citizens were utilizing like cryptocurrency
Mhm.
to just have some sort of commerce. But I haven't heard much about it in a couple of years. Is it doing the same? Is it doing any better? Do you know, or is it any chance or not doing that well?
I've heard about it. I'm not sure how it's been used. I know that the cryptocurrencies are actually an interesting kind of dynamic because essentially they are able to avoid sanctions in a very unique way. So that was, at a time, kind of helpful. I don't know about now. I know the last time I remember really reading about that was probably 6 months ago, a year ago. So if you Google it, I bet you'll find some cool stuff. But it's still definitely a thing that is in the running to change the dynamics with sanctions. But it's
And
cool.
then follow up, like I know now, it may not be related, but the new trade deal, but it's Mexico, Canada, and U.S. And I don't know if that's going to affect just because Mexico is a border neighboring country. The trade, are there any rallies or protests up against the trade deal?
I'm not sure. I have to look and see. There might be, but I'm not sure. But, cool. Anyone have any other questions or any other thoughts just about this topic or anything? I can share about the embassy a bit.
Well, what about Yemen? Is that, we discussed Yemen at all, or were you involved in any protests against the Yemen civil war, proxy war?
I know, like for us, we had done for Yemen is generally just talking about the fact that there is an ongoing war in Yemen, and the U.S. completely ignores it for the most part. But I don't really know off the top of my head what we've done recently for Yemen. No, I know recently we've been doing stuff for like about Iraq, actually because there's a really incredible revolutionary movement happening right now in Iraq, which is it's very violent. Like the government is very repressive there. Instituted by the United States, and there's a very long history there. And for the Middle East, same thing with Lebanon right now, there's a lot going on there. But in terms of Yemen, nothing that I can think of recently that comes to mind. Yeah.
I know the Answer Coalition during the whole Iraq thing was very good at organizing protests and getting buses down to Washington and all over and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering at this point, what's the Answer Coalition? What is, let's say, like Green Party, we engage in social action. We're also an electoral party.
Mm-hmm.
What does the Answer Coalition do electorally, or if anything? Are you involved in, let's say, getting people elected, or that whole kind of thing? Or is it just in movement building that you're involved in?
It's a coalition. So, coalition efforts are complicated. But coalition efforts are, it's a coalition. We're made up of several different organizations. Some organizations are more involved in electoral, kind of running elections or being part of elections than other organizations. Some organizations are very single issue. It all depends who's coming to the table. We had a lot more partners in early days of Answer because, during the Iraq War, we had a lot of different organizations. Today, we're really kind of more based in DC, and we work a lot, of course, with Code Pink and other groups like that. And so, you know that kind of work, that at the end of the day, it's a coalition effort to bring together different elements of a movement. But, in my opinion, a coalition effort, that is where it begins and ends, right? Like you're bringing people together, you're being able to have a unified message for people, which is important right now, especially when we're talking about anti-imperialism and fighting against the United States. But, there obviously needs to be more than that. I'm also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. That's an organization that's been a part of the Answer Coalition for many years, one of the leading organizations of the effort. So we run our own elections, we have our own campaign coming up, but that's completely different as an organization. But yes, we're a coalition, so it's a little different. But cool. Anyone else have anything else they're wondering or thoughts, I guess, to take away?
I don't know if this is relevant, but I know one of the baristas at Starbucks is Chilean.
Mm-hmm.
And she wrote a piece, I forget what site she writes on, but she basically wrote that there were 3 generations that have experienced, this horrible massacre. And how does that play in with this? It's like, Cause I know she has family down there and they send videos
Mhm.
and you see them bombing and it's
Yeah.
really horrendous stuff.
Yeah, it's really crazy what's going on in Chile right now. We have a couple Chilean organizers that are back and forth and down there and talk about it. But I mean, what I would say that ties in is like the history of Allende.
Yes.
That to me is like what I really like draw on is like that makes perfect sense. And in some ways it's unfortunate because unlike one of the big strengths of Venezuela had been also not just people supporting the president, which also believe me, there's a massive support for Evo Morales, but also people are very far away. And the idea of building a people's militia was very unique to Venezuela, and Allende didn't really do that, and that's in some ways decisive. So I think the Venezuelan government looks a lot at that situation as a way to influence the way that they make choices and the way that they mobilize people, because with Allende that wasn't the case.
Right.
And so to what's going on now today, what I can say of what I'm aware of, a lot of the repression. I do have a show. I'll go for it.
Just because before you were talking about Venezuela drawing on like the experience at Allende in Chile, I know that going back to coup earlier this century that happened against Chavez,
Yeah.
there's a moment there as this coup is taking place that was recorded where Chavez is basically sitting in his office, and in front of him he has a pistol sitting on his desk, and he's contemplating suicide during this coup. As that happens, he ends up getting a call from Fidel Castro, and Castro says to him, Chavez, don't die, don't be a martyr like Allende, you must survive. And Chavez decides not to kill himself, and then obviously later on the coup is overturned by the populace in Venezuela, and then you see this building up of these like people's militias. You see the more consolidation of power within like the military and the government. So I definitely think that those like parallels between the Chilean experience and the Venezuelan experience and how Venezuela then adapted definitely does draw on like that whole experience.
For sure. It's cool. Venezuela is also opening up a college. They're opening up like a program kind of like the way Cuba has an exportation of doctors. They also want to work on creating exportation of journalists, which is very exciting because one of the things that they've recognized as a country is that really, I mean, what is journalism in the 21st century? The 6 companies in the United States control all of the media. Actually, they merged, now it's 5. It's like Disney, it's like, you can Google it, it's a crazy, like, if you look at it, it shows all of them. Like, they're all connected. So, I mean, that's realistically what we're looking at here. And so, journalism is not something that is really, the stories are just not told. They're not told properly, they're not told at all. Or if they are told, they have such heavy U.S. hands, State Department hands in them, you gotta question it. Like I always say that, like, it's crazy. Like, how is it that we knew during the Ferguson uprising?
May I have your attention, please?
Sorry.
The library is closing
You
at
do have to
9
leave at
p.m.
9.
Please bring all
It's all
materials
good.
to the checkout desk now. Also, the computers will be turned off at this time. Storage areas are now unavailable. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyways, the point is just how important it is to counteract propaganda. That this is propaganda. What we're hearing from the United States is propaganda. That doesn't mean there isn't nuance or complexity in situations, but I really recommend, if you can read Spanish, to read even newspapers of other countries. In Latin America, you'll get a different perspective radically from what you get here in the U.S. And also the Organization of American States, like, it's just there's so many reasons why you can really see that this is propaganda, because what the United States really props up and holds up as legitimate versus illegitimate is fascinating. OAS is one of those structures, you could say, that's quite the same. I mean, the whole reason why Venezuela rejoined the Organization of American States was because Guaido said that they would, which is like, dude's not even the president. How can he say that? That makes no sense. But that's a whole other conversation.
I find, and we were discussing this, that there are fairly intelligent people out there that are very supportive of right-wing, like very pro-Trump supporters, and you're thinking, how did this happen? But I don't know if this this is correct or not, but I find that people that don't travel, that stay within the perimeter of their, their community, have a very narrow view of life and have no concept of a global, existence, as opposed to my friends that do travel, like to all over, have more open opinions and are more open to other types of news and.
It's true. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I think a lot of it has to do with my perspective on like right-wing concepts. A lot of it has to do with class-based, like what your class is going to determine a lot about what you want, what you care about, what you're going to do. Same goes for why people join right-wing movements in Venezuela. If you're middle class and you're pissed that you now have to wait in line for hours in different places that you might not have had to do before, and you're gonna be angry. I mean, there aren't the lines in the supermarkets, all that isn't true. Max Blumenthal did a great piece on that. If you wanna watch it, Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone Project, he's a really cool guy. But he went to Venezuela and did all of these different interviews and just videos like going in to all of the supermarkets. So when I say it's like propaganda, like that's a really great piece he has that breaks down how it's obviously propaganda, where you keep hearing over and over again, food shortages, all this stuff that isn't true, not actually at all. Like if you go into the grocery stores, the problem is that olive oil costs triple what it should cost. That's the problem. People can't afford it, and the government is now trying to subsidize it, but there isn't this mass shortage where all the shelves are empty. So you'll see a lot of like the Gusanos were saying stuff like that, and that just isn't true, actually at all. So that's a good one. But yeah, I always recommend Max Blumenthal, the Gray Zone Project, Ben Norton, he's a really cool guy. He's also a great journalist. They are really well researched, really go in depth with stuff. I really recommend them. I know the Empire Files also, that's some people we work with. Addie Martin, she's a really somewhat known journalist. She's great, and she has really good stuff. So if you want to follow up and learn more, those are places I recommend looking. I have a show on WBAI too. If you listen to BAI, I'm now going to be on Fridays 3 to 5, so I cover a lot of this stuff. But yeah, hope I could touch points on a bunch of things to just try to whet your interest in Venezuela and just do more of that research and really, really look out for yourself, because the propaganda here is thick, and never believe what the US says. It's almost always a lie. So, anywho, cool.
As my girlfriend says, they swallowed the Kool-Aid.
Yes,
Yeah.
very true.